So probably one of the most requested guides that we've been asked for, and that's the Honda Civic. It's no surprise the Honda Civic is an extremely popular car. There's so many aftermarket parts for it, and it's available now in 10 generations. So the production run of the Civic has lasted from early times. The third generation was actually released in 1983. So as I grew up, the third generation was generally the Civic that everyone wanted. But every year they've brought out better and better versions. So let's look at the best mods and upgrades for your Honda Civic. I'm going to do some more specific guides because there are a few differences between the generations. So I'm going to keep this very general, looking at the general methods of tuning your Civic and upgrading it, and which parts work the best and what your approach should be to tuning it. So first up, we're just going to look at improving the handling. So when people look at the Honda Civic, they're often looking at the Type R as inspiration for their project. And I really have to point out that the Type R is usually quite a different car from the base Civic. So the Honda engineers have generally reworked everything they can to create that Type R race version of the Civic. So it doesn't share very many components with the stock Civic other than its general appearance. It's certainly not impossible to source those Type R parts and fit them to your Civic, and if you've got a breakers yard near you that specialises in Honda Civics, it can often be a cheap way of doing an upgrade. But bear in mind there's often a knock-on effect with parts, so if you want to use the brake discs you may need to get the hubs as well from the Type R, and that may also necessitate an upgrade the servo that drives the brakes as well. So depending on your generation there's a few little nuances to be aware of. But uprating the handling of your Civic is generally down to the suspension setup. Now avoid the common myth of going as low and as hard as possible. There's usually a fine line between the optimal setup and a terrible setup. So just finding where it is. Generally, we would only recommend you drop your Civic by about 20 to 40 millimeters. Again, it depends a lot on the version of Civic that you've got, its generation and the size of the alloy wheels that you've got on it. We find in most cases that you should avoid large alloy wheels. They look great on the Civic, but large alloy wheels add a lot of unsprung weight to each corner of the car, and that's really not good for handling and performance. Most people we've spoken to that are using the car on roads with rough surfaces and in wet conditions actually prefer the handling of the slightly smaller rim sizes and slightly smaller wheel sizes. It just allows you to use a higher profile tyre, which is a lot more forgiving and provides better handling characteristics in the extreme road conditions. If you're only using it on a dry track, it's a completely different story. So going for larger wheels with ultra low profile tyres makes a lot of sense. But just getting a decent set of coilovers and fairly lightweight alloy wheels all round and a decent set of tyres can go a long way to improving the handling. But before you've even done that, you should look at the general setup of the car. So make sure the suspension alignment is correct. You can do a lot to improve the handling just by altering the camber and the toe. So you would usually need to fit an additional suspension adjustment kit to allow you to make wider adjustments to those settings. But just getting the camber, the toe and all the other characteristics spot on can do a lot to improve the cornering or the straight line stability of your Civic. Got a little favour to ask, can you just drop us a like, and please in the comments let us know what car you've got, what your plans are for it, what mods you've got and what your experiences are. It really helps us to get out there. We're a very small channel, so we really appreciate the feedback from our viewers. And look at those bushings as well. The rubber bushings that the suspension mounts on often wears over time, so the suspension components will start to slop around a little bit more and it'll be outside the tolerances of what Honda originally designed. So getting uprated polyurethane bushes can make quite a big difference to the handling on most models. Bear in mind some of the newer Civics have actually got liquid filled bushings to really smooth out the ride quality. So if you put really hard polyurethane bushings on those, you would lose that smooth characteristics that Honda have engineered into the car. But sometimes that's the price you pay for extra performance and handling. So brake upgrades also make a lot of difference to the Civic. So often within the models you can swap out the higher powered versions. Some of the smaller engine versions have often got undersized discs, or you can get cheap upgrades from your local breakers yard. Or as we've said earlier, just fitting the Honda Civic Type R discs, if available, with all the ancillary components and hubs and the setup on your car, can make quite a difference to the performance. So generally, if your discs are slightly larger, they'll be better at dissipating the heat and you'll have better stopping. But even on a stock system, getting a decent set of pads can make a world of difference to the handling. So avoid the cheap aftermarket pads that have got low wear, because that usually means low friction and low stopping ability. So although it might last a long time, it'll be absolutely terrible. But getting yourself a decent set of pads can go a long way to improving your Civic stopping power. But don't go to race pads, because race spec pads are designed to operate at race temperatures, and on the road the pads are usually cold most of the time and they're just outside of the operating range. They also can be quite noisy if used on a road car and are generally an annoyance. So I would certainly flag up the problems that you would get going to race spec pads when you should just be going for a decent fast road pad from a quality aftermarket manufacturer. For more information on pads that we recommend, see our website. We've got detailed articles on each of the generations of Civic. And please, in the comments, let us know what you found to be the most optimal setup for your Civic and any mods that you've done, because that helps us to improve the articles and the information that I'm able to give out. So further improvement to the brakes might include adding drilled brakes or vented brakes. So they're even better at dissipating the heat and preventing that layer of gas that builds up as the pads connect to the brake disc under high temperatures. So there's so many different options out there. You've just really got to find something that suits your budget. And bear in mind that your car will only stop based on the level of grip that your tyres can actually provide. So you can fit the largest brakes possible, but if your tyres start to lose traction and prevent that stopping ability, you're wasting your money. So don't spend too much on your brake upgrades and maybe just focus on improving the pads. Most Civics I've driven have actually got pretty good brakes to start with. So coming into the engine itself, you've got quite a big range of engines through Honda. You've got the D series, the K series. There's so many different engines they've produced, and they often can be swapped quite easily between models. We've got an article on our site that goes into Civic engine swaps. So if you want more information on what engines fit in what Civics and what the characteristics are of the engines to help you choose one for your project, please drop by. I'll put a link below so you can get easy access to it. But the VTEC engines are absolutely amazing engines. The overall Honda engines are just really well built. They seem to be experts at extracting as much power from a naturally aspirated engine as possible. They're nicely constructed, they're usually very well balanced, and they generally have a much higher red line than typical cars from European manufacturers. So it lends themselves really nicely to tuning. So we'll just have a very quick run through of all the different series of engines that Honda have manufactured and just pick out some of the highlights for each one. But there's a lot of regional variation, which I'm going to go into in the individual videos for each of these engines, just to help you get a feel for where you can source power mods and upgrades for your particular engine code. So we've got to start off with the B series, which ran from 1989 to 2000. It was fuel injected. There was a few VTEC versions of the engine. So VTEC actually stands for Variable Valve Timing and Electronic Lift Control. So it alters the way that the valves open and close, and they typically have two different cam profiles to achieve this. So it's a very clever mechanism, and it's something that Honda have pioneered, and it really makes their engines stand out and different from most other manufacturers. The B series engine was actually the performance variable, which generally had a double overhead camshaft, and it was sold concurrently with the D series, which only had a single overhead camshaft, and it was replaced fairly recently by the K series. So the D series came from 1991 to 2005. There's some lovely engines, lots of different sizes. They were generally the economical variants of the engines, mainly 1.6 or 1.7 litres of displacement, but there were a few small engines at 1.4 and 1.5. Then we've got the E series, which ran from 73 to 84. So you can see the letters certainly don't correlate with the years that the engines came out and were used. Now this was interesting because it used compound vortex controlled combustion, CVCC for short, and this enabled them to meet the emissions regulations way back in the 70s without having to use a catalytic converter. So it was very, very innovative at the time. The L series ran from 2001 to about 2016, and it was interesting because there were some turbo versions available. So nice to see Honda experimenting with turbocharging in common production models and being able to extract so much power from these wonderful engines that have traditionally always been naturally aspirated. You've got the R series that ran from 2006 to 2013, the awesome K series, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the best engines that Honda have ever produced. It's certainly one engine we get a lot of comments, questions and feedback on, with people wanting to use them in their projects. And there's some really good power gains you can get out of the K series. So we've got a video coming up very soon on the K series, so if you haven't subscribed, please do so and catch that video. We often recommend camshafts for most naturally aspirated engines, but if you've got VTEC, you've essentially got a sports cam profile already in that engine. So what you can do on most of the VTEC engines is get that VTEC mechanism to kick in slightly earlier. So you come into the VTEC zone at lower RPMs, and you would generally achieve that by using some sort of aftermarket ECU or some sort of plug-in module to address that. So Hondata is quite a popular one. Apexy do quite a range of aftermarket ECUs, and there's a lot to choose from when it comes to aftermarket ECU. Think about your project and how far you're willing to take it before you invest in your aftermarket ECU upgrade. But for most people, the Hondata allows enough control over the ECU and the settings to just extract that little bit more power. Another popular engine mod on these naturally aspirated Civics is individual throttle bodies on the intake. So changing the trumpet size on those throttle bodies can actually alter where in the RPM range you get the power, and can just allow you to really fine tune the air and fuel delivery into the engine to just balance everything up, and it allows you to extract the maximum amount of power from your project. They also look great under the engine bay, and some people actually quote better fuel economy when they fitted these aftermarket throttle bodies, but it depends a lot on how the car is tuned and set up as to whether it's providing more economy or purely for extra power. Another mod that a lot of people do to their Honda is adding an induction kit which replaces the airbox and air filter with a cone style filter that theoretically allows more air to be sucked into the engine. So depending on the Honda engine you've got, sometimes these are actually quite a good idea because the stock system is running pretty much at the limits. These engines are high revving, they move an awful lot of air, and if you've increased the power and the amount of air that's going into them, it certainly makes sense to up its ability to breathe, because you are almost certainly hitting a restriction. But on some models, adding an induction kit makes very little difference to the overall power, so you'll effectively be wasting your money, and you'd be better off just going with a panel air filter, a performance version of that, which flows much better than the paper alternatives. So with Honda exhaust mods and upgrades, it certainly makes sense to make sure that the engine can not only breathe in, but can also breathe out. So any restrictions in the flow of the exhaust could be a potential bottleneck. The Civic exhausts generally flow quite well. If you've got a catalyst fitted, that's usually the bottleneck within the exhaust system. So fitting a sports cat, an aftermarket catalyst, can usually improve the airflow. I know that's not legal in every area. Certainly removing the cat altogether is illegal in most regions and most areas, and I certainly wouldn't recommend you do that, because the aftermarket alternatives and sports cats are so good, you'll not see very much of a gain comparing an aftermarket exhaust with a sports cat with a decat one, or one that's had the catalyst removed altogether. Now, I always say to people, don't go with the largest exhaust you can find. Most people have in their mind that a large bore exhaust will actually flow really well, but one of the most important things when tuning a car's intake and exhaust is to make sure the velocity is correct. So ideally you'll have a system where the exhaust and the intake is closed up at low RPMs, and then it opens up at higher RPMs, which is mechanically very, very challenging. A few manufacturers have got systems that effectively achieve this, but in most cases it's just a case of compromising and getting an optimal setup that gives you the best flow rates in the bits of the power band that you use the most often. So on an engine like the K20, most people I've spoken to recommend about a 3-inch bore size on the exhaust as being round about the optimal setup. But obviously the way the exhaust is constructed, the bends in it, what it's made from, and how the silencer works, whether it's just got baffles or it's got a more sports straight through silencer setup, will make a big difference to its ability to free up the flow of air through the engine. So the heads on the engines flow pretty well. The valves are quite nicely set up. So you don't really need to start thinking about improving those on most of the blocks until you start hitting those massive power figures. So Honda have done a really good job at setting up the engine, which gives you a really nice base to work on. Now the flywheel is the big mass on the side of the engine that stores the kinetic energy, and going slightly lighter on that will allow the engine to rev more quickly. The rev increase and decrease will be much faster. The engine will feel more responsive. You'll be able to unleash that power that little bit sooner. I would argue that it probably doesn't add power to the engine. It will make the car a little bit lighter because you're saving a little bit of weight, but generally it just improves the characteristics and the response of the engine itself. Intake and exhaust mods are popular upgrades for the Civic. Again, Honda have done a pretty good job on the stock intake, so you don't look at a restriction appearing until you've got another 20, 30, maybe even 40% more power going into the engine. So most projects seem to go with induction kits, but the induction kits often suck warm air in from the engine bay, which is not a great characteristic in a tuned car. So if you do go with an induction kit, make sure it's separated from those warm temperatures and you've got a cold air feed leading into it. And be careful where you site that cold air feed. You certainly don't want to be sucking water up into the intake. That's not going to do your engine any good at all. Fueling upgrades, uprating the fuel pressure regulator can force those injectors to deliver a little bit more fuel to the engine itself. It makes the throttle response a little more snappy and can just give you a little bit more headroom, but you may have to uprate the injectors if you've made substantial power gains to your engine. Depends how aggressive you've been with the ECU tuning and that aftermarket ECU. So another thing that often happens on these Honda Civic engines, particularly the K series, is turbo upgrades. There's quite a few kits around where people have got all of the ancillary components, they've worked out the mapping, the timing, they've got an intercooler, and all the pipework is just designed for the Honda Civic engine itself. And they've become relatively easy to bolt on. Now I say easy, adding a turbo is never an easy project, but it will add substantial amounts more power to your project. So in some cases you might be able to double the power that your engine actually releases. So we've got more articles coming on Honda specific engines and how far you can take them and specific tips. So please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Really appreciate you watching the video and following us, and please drop us a like. Don't forget to stay tuned and I'll see you in the next video.